The world thought it had Africa figured out, until one man changed everything. Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, just pulled off a $1.2 billion deal with India. Not for gold, not for weapons, but for tractors. Machines that could transform an entire nation overnight. How did he do it? Stay with us as we uncover the full story behind this audacious, world-shaking move. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button if you love epic stories of courage and innovation. Subscribe for more cinematic breakdowns of incredible global events. And turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the action. The whispers began in the corridors of power, carried not by journalists or open declarations, but in hushed tones between diplomats, generals, and bankers who could not comprehend what they had just learned. Somewhere in Africa, a nation long written off as insignificant had signed a deal so large, so improbable, that the foundations of global trade seemed to tremble. A $1.2 billion agreement with India, not for weapons or oil, but for tractors. Machines of earth, steel, and fuel, destined not for war, but for soil. Yet in the darkness of conference rooms from Washington to Paris, the reaction was not celebration. It was fear. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country that had for decades been the subject of pity, sanctions, and quiet mockery, suddenly stood at the center of a geopolitical storm. No one could explain how it happened. No one could predict what it would mean. The leaders of the old world leaned forward, anxious, as reports came in. To them, tractors were not just machines. They were the possibility of Africa breaking free from hunger, from dependence, from centuries of carefully maintained weakness. And the man behind it all was a young soldier who had dared to defy the world, Ibrahim Traoré. But the story did not begin with headlines or contracts. It began in silence, in dust, in the endless stretch of African fields where farmers bent their backs beneath a punishing sun, where children went to bed on empty stomachs, and where mothers prayed not for wealth but simply for rain. For generations, Burkina Faso's soil had been rich but wasted, exploited in fragments by corporations that came only for minerals, never for the people. The world was content to keep it that way, until Traoré rose. He had come from the ranks of the military, not as a polished politician, but as a man forged in scarcity. To him, every grain of millet mattered. Every farmer's struggle was a battlefield of its own. He knew hunger personally. He had seen entire villages collapse, not because the soil had failed, but because the tools to harness it were never provided. Aid had been promised for decades, but aid was always temporary, never enough, never designed to liberate. And so, beneath his calm exterior, a plan grew. Rumors first spread among the villages. Men in suits from India had been spotted in Ouagadougou. They were not diplomats nor soldiers, but something stranger. Agricultural engineers and business negotiators who spoke in guarded tones about machines that could change a continent. At first, the whispers seemed absurd. How could Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, even imagine such a colossal purchase? The numbers made no sense. The economy was fragile, the treasury strained, and yet contracts worth $1.2 billion were being drafted in secrecy. Outside Burkina Faso, suspicion grew. France wanted answers. The IMF raised its eyebrows, demanding figures and explanations. Intelligence agencies tapped phones, monitored flights, and tracked shipments across the Indian Ocean. It must be a cover, they said. It cannot be tractors. It must be uranium or gold, or weapons. And yet, as days turned into weeks, the evidence pointed to the same impossible truth. Ibrahim Traoré was preparing an agricultural revolution. Inside the country, not everyone shared his faith. 3 powerful elites, generals who had once fought beside him, began to question his gamble. They whispered in private. Tractors could not feed the people overnight, and $1.2 billion was a debt that could cripple the nation if things went wrong. Was he truly leading Burkina Faso to independence, or was he walking them into a trap designed by greater powers? Suspicion spread like fire, and already there were shadows moving in the background. Men willing to sabotage, to betray, to ensure this revolution never took root. Meanwhile, in dusty villages, hope flickered. Farmers who had spent lifetimes working with wooden plows suddenly imagined fields stretching with green. Harvests measured not in handfuls but in markets overflowing with food. Mothers whispered to their children that maybe, just maybe, the hunger would end. But alongside hope came doubt. No one in Africa had ever dared to think so boldly, and history was filled with the bodies of leaders who tried, and so the world watched. Allies questioned, enemies plotted. The people waited. In a continent scarred by betrayal, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of an unthinkable gamble. What he did next would not only decide the fate of his nation, but shake the world itself. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré was not a tale of luxury or inheritance, but of grit and scars. He had grown up not in the polished homes of Ouagadougou's elites, but in the villages where cracked earth swallowed seeds and the horizon seemed endless yet empty. His childhood was defined by the sound of hunger, the silence of empty plates, the sharp cries of children at night, and the low murmurs of elders who remembered better days that never seemed to return. He carried these memories into the army, where discipline and hardship molded him further. To the outside world, he was another African officer in a forgotten land. But those who stood close to him knew he bore something heavier, the weight of unfinished promises, of generations chained to a cycle of dependence. By the time he took power, the shadow of Thomas Sankara still loomed over Burkina Faso like a ghostly reminder. Sankara had once tried to liberate the nation through self-reliance, rejecting foreign aid and calling for Africa to rise on its own. His ideas had been radical, his charisma undeniable, but his life cut short by betrayal. For decades, Burkina Faso's leaders had avoided speaking Sankara's name too loudly, fearing both his spirit and the wrath of those who killed him. Traoré, however, did not fear. He carried Sankara's memory like a flame in his chest, refusing to let it die. And yet the soil told its own story. Across the countryside, men and women fought against land with their bare hands, scratching out survival with rusted hoes and wooden plows, unchanged for centuries. When the rains came late, famine followed. When disease struck the crops, there was no backup, no machines to save the harvest. Aid trucks would arrive eventually, with banners of foreign flags, delivering sacks of grain that ran out in weeks. Each time it happened, the cycle repeated. Hunger, dependence, survival. The people had come to expect little from their leaders, and even less from the world. Then came whispers of a secret negotiation. Traoré had been meeting with Indian officials under the cover of trade summits, slipping into closed rooms without cameras. What they discussed remained hidden from the public eye, but rumors painted the picture of something unthinkable. Not aid, not loans, but an outright purchase. Tractors. Tens of thousands of them. Engines capable of reshaping entire landscapes, plowing fields that had long been left barren. It was too big, too ambitious, too dangerous. In the palaces of Europe, the news caused unease. France, which had long considered Burkina Faso within its orbit, demanded answers. Officials in Washington filed urgent reports. The IMF, already pressuring the nation over its gold reserves, began quietly sending warnings. No African state had ever dared to sign an agricultural deal of this magnitude without Western oversight. To them, the logic was simple. If Africa learned to feed itself, control would slip from their hands. Inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere grew tense. Among Traoré's inner circle, 3 generals began voicing doubt. They had stood beside him when he seized power, when bullets and chaos had tested their loyalty, but now they saw the $1.2 billion figure as reckless. "What if India turns against us?" one muttered in private. "What if the West blocks the shipments? What if this bankrupts us before the first harvest arrives?" Their voices carried in quiet corners, their doubts feeding suspicion. Betrayal, after all, was not foreign to this land. Traoré knew the risks. The numbers looked impossible to many, but numbers alone could not measure desperation. He saw not just machines, but an army of steel that could cut through centuries of stagnation. Every tractor was a weapon against hunger, every shipment a declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer bow its head. He imagined fields once abandoned now lush with crops, markets filled with food instead of empty promises. The vision drove him forward even as shadows gathered. Meanwhile, among the people, the rumor spread like wildfire. In the villages, Farmers whispered over evening fires that their leader had found a way to change everything. Some believed, their eyes bright with a hope they had not felt in decades. Others shook their heads, hardened by years of disappointment. To them, it was another fantasy that would collapse when foreign powers intervened. Mothers tucked their children into bed and prayed quietly, uncertain whether to hope or to brace for another heartbreak. Beyond Africa, intelligence agencies scrambled. Satellites tracked cargo ships moving across the Indian Ocean. Cryptic cables warned of hidden agreements. Some claimed Traoré was trading uranium. Others whispered of rare earth minerals buried deep in Burkina Faso's soil. Nobody believed it could be just tractors. The simplicity of the deal made it even more suspicious. Why would India risk alienating the West for agriculture unless something else lay hidden beneath the surface? In the darkness of these suspicions, Traoré remained silent. He spoke little of the deal publicly, avoiding grand declarations. Instead, he moved carefully, step by step, his eyes set on the horizon. For every whisper of betrayal, he tightened his circle. For every rumor of sabotage, he reminded himself that revolutions were not built on comfort, but on storms. The tractors were coming, and with them, a future that no one could yet imagine. But shadows were moving too. Hidden hands were already writing plans to disrupt shipments, to block ports, to ignite dissent inside his own country. The more the world learned, the more it plotted against him. The tractors had not yet touched African soil, and already the war for them had begun. The first signs of resistance were not loud. They came in coded memos, in the silences between diplomats, in the sudden hesitation of banks. The IMF, faceless but suffocating, declared new concerns over Burkina Faso's creditworthiness. Payment systems began to slow. Insurance companies quietly pulled back from covering shipments bound for West Africa. On paper, nothing had been cancelled. But in reality, every step of the $1.2 billion tractor deal was now under siege. Traoré understood immediately what was happening. This was not about numbers. It was about power. If tractors rolled into Burkina Faso, if farmers suddenly had the machines to transform barren land into overflowing fields, then a precedent would be set, one that threatened centuries of dependency. The West had tolerated Africa's leaders who begged, who borrowed, who bartered in weakness. But a leader who planned to feed his people without permission? That was unforgivable. The weight of sabotage grew heavier each day. Reports filtered in of unknown agents moving through the ports of Mumbai and Chennai, spreading bribes, whispering threats. One shipment bound for Burkina Faso suddenly failed inspection. Another mysteriously caught fire before loading. Indian newspapers reported only fragments, never the full picture. But inside Burkina Faso, the rumors swelled into a storm. Farmers who had begun to dream of tractors working their fields now feared the dream would vanish before it arrived. Inside the barracks of Ouagadougou, unease spread among the soldiers. Some asked why so much of the nation's fortune was being poured into a gamble. Others feared the wrath of the IMF, remembering how other African states had been broken by sanctions and isolation. The generals who had once only whispered their doubts now began to act. They held secret meetings, carefully hidden from Traoré's eyes, testing the loyalty of those beneath them. If the tractors failed to arrive, they reasoned, Traoré's credibility would collapse, and with it, his power. Meanwhile, the suffering of ordinary people grew worse. Sanctions and financial blockades strangled imports. Food prices rose sharply. In the villages, mothers wept as they buried children whose small bodies could not withstand hunger. Every tragedy became another reason for skeptics to mutter that the deal was cursed, that Traoré's gamble had doomed them all. Darkness hung over the land, heavy and relentless, even as the vision of roaring tractors remained alive only in rumor. And yet, in the heart of this despair, Traoré pressed forward. He sent emissaries to India, not once, but again and again, refusing to let the deal collapse. He moved gold quietly through secret channels, using reserves hidden from the IMF's grasp. He spoke little in public, but to his closest allies, he revealed the depth of his resolve. If they destroy this deal, he said, they destroy our future. We cannot let them win. The world beyond Africa trembled with unease. Intelligence reports grew frantic. What was Traoré truly offering India in return? Some claimed it was uranium, others swore it was land, still others believed there was a hidden military clause buried within the contracts. None of it could be confirmed. The mystery itself became its own weapon, unsettling the old order. For every question, no clear answer came. Only the growing certainty that Traoré was playing a game far larger than tractors alone. Then came the infiltration. In the southern reaches of Burkina Faso, rebel groups long supplied by shadowy patrons began to stir. Attacks on border villages increased. Trucks carrying grain were ambushed. Soldiers found caches of weapons too advanced for ragtag fighters. Traoré's enemies were no longer waiting for the tractors to arrive. They were striking before they could. The pressure reached a breaking point. Hunger clawed at the people. The IMF tightened its grip. Generals muttered in dark rooms. Rebels pushed harder against the borders. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, facing a choice that seemed impossible. Surrender to the forces strangling him and abandon the tractor deal, or push forward into the storm, risking the collapse of everything he had built. Nights in Ouagadougou grew tense. Lights burned late in government offices. Soldiers patrolled with unease, aware that betrayal could come from within their own ranks. Farmers prayed for rain, but also for steel, for the machines that might finally break their chains. The deal with India was no longer just a contract. It had become a battlefield, one where bullets and bombs were replaced with sabotage, betrayal, and hunger. And still the question remained unanswered. Would the tractors ever reach Burkina Faso? Or would the shadows win before the dawn arrived? The morning the first shipment was scheduled to dock, the tension in Ouagadougou was palpable. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Traoré moved among his inner circle with an air of calm determination, concealing the storm swirling around him. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, every report of delayed shipments, every rumor of sabotage, pressed against him like the weight of 100 years of history. This was no ordinary negotiation, no routine political maneuver. This was a battle for the future of his country, and every move counted. At the port, chaos had already begun. Cranes lifted containers with meticulous precision, yet shadows danced between stacks of cargo, men in unmarked uniforms slipping through unnoticed. Explosions were narrowly avoided as an attempt to destroy one of the shipments was intercepted at the last second. Reports came in, forged documents, tampered seals, insider threats. The conspiracy to halt the tractors was unfolding in real time. Traoré's planners worked feverishly to reroute trucks, coordinate security, and anticipate the next move. Every second mattered. Inside his command center, Traoré examined maps, manifests, and satellite images. He traced the path of each container with relentless focus. This was no longer a logistical operation. It was a high-stakes chess game with lives and livelihoods as the pieces. For weeks, he had prepared for every possible scenario, yet the ingenuity and audacity of his adversaries still threatened to overwhelm him. And yet he never wavered. Even as whispers of betrayal echoed in the hallways, generals questioning his strategy, advisors unsure whether the nation could survive a failed gamble, he pressed forward. Meanwhile, in the fields outside the city, farmers waited. Some had seen the crates arrive on distant shores. Others had only heard the rumors. Children ran alongside the dirt roads, eyes bright with anticipation, imagining iron beasts that could turn barren land into fertile rows. Mothers whispered prayers of hope, each word a defiance against decades of despair. But the threat of sabotage lingered like a storm cloud, and not everyone dared to believe that the machines would arrive. Back at the port, the tension reached a breaking point. Rebels and saboteurs attempted to halt the trucks transporting the tractors inland. There were skirmishes in the shadows, small explosions, and moments of panic, but Traoré's loyal forces met each challenge with precision. Each confrontation was a test of nerves, a testament to the discipline he had instilled in his men. Slowly, the tractors began moving, one by one, across the landscape, their engines humming like the heartbeat of a nation on the brink of transformation. The generals who had doubted Traoré watched from the sidelines, forced to confront the reality of his resolve. Their whispers of rebellion, their clandestine plots, faltered against the sheer audacity of the operation. Traoré had anticipated their resistance, had fortified every route, and had outmaneuvered every attempt to undermine him. The tractors were unstoppable, not because of raw force, but because of strategy, vision, and an unwavering commitment to a goal that transcended fear. By nightfall, the first of the machines reached the outermost farms. The sight was almost surreal. Tractors lined in the moonlight, engines rumbling softly, ready to reclaim the land. Villagers gathered, some in disbelief, others with tears streaming down their faces. The air was thick with anticipation, hope, and a fragile sense of victory. Traoré watched from a distance, aware that this moment was a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent's perception of possibility. Even as the tractors roared to life, the world reacted. Governments that had doubted him scrambled to understand the mechanics of the deal. Analysts debated whether it was luck, cunning, or a masterstroke of diplomacy. The West, blindsided and unnerved, began recalculating their assumptions about African potential. And inside Burkina Faso, the impossible had become tangible. The dream of liberation through innovation and persistence was unfolding before their eyes. Traoré, standing in the midst of it all, allowed himself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The shadows had tested him. The world had doubted him. Yet here he was, orchestrating a revolution that did not rely on force of arms, but on courage, ingenuity, and the determination to change his people's destiny. The tractors moved forward, engines alive with promise, and for the first time in decades, the horizon seemed wide, bright, and full of possibility. The land had begun to breathe again. Fields that once lay fallow now hummed with life as the tractors rolled steadily, transforming Burkina Faso's landscape 1 acre at a time. The rumble of engines became a chorus of hope, echoing through villages that had known only hunger and scarcity. Children ran alongside the machines, laughing for the first time in years, while mothers watched their families with cautious but growing optimism. The impossible had arrived, carried not by foreign aid, but by the vision and courage of one man, Ibrahim Traoré. Across the continent, the impact of the deal rippled like shock waves. Economists and diplomats scrambled to understand the consequences. The IMF, long accustomed to controlling nations through debt and leverage, was humiliated. Reports circulated of global analysts stunned by Burkina Faso's audacity. A country had negotiated a $1.2 billion trade not for gold or oil, but for agriculture, creating a self-sustaining path that defied centuries of dependency. The old powers had underestimated the resourcefulness and determination of a leader who refused to play by their rules. Inside Burkina Faso, the people's spirits soared. Farmers, once resigned to cycles of famine, now cultivated fields that promised abundance. Markets overflowed with grain and produce. The tractors became symbols, not merely of machinery, but of resilience, ingenuity, and the right to self-determination. Villages that had seemed trapped in endless struggle now whispered of the possibilities ahead. Electricity, schools, roads, and health centers fueled by the wealth of their own labor. Traoré's gamble had transformed not just the land, but the imagination of a nation. The generals who had doubted him were left speechless. Their plots and hesitations melted away in the face of undeniable success. They had feared collapse, feared ruin, but now they saw a future reshaped not through fear, but through daring, calculated action. Even the skeptics among the populace, hardened by years of disappointment, began to hope again. They realized that this was not luck or accident. It was leadership, vision, and courage manifesting in tangible results. Traoré himself became more than a leader. He became a symbol. International media could not ignore him, and for the first time, stories of Africa's potential dominated headlines, not its crises. The tractors were more than machines. They were a statement. Africa could act decisively, creatively, and independently. The world had been shocked, not by weapons or protests, but by a calculated act of transformation, a demonstration that ingenuity and boldness could shift global perception in a single, audacious move. As the sun set over the newly plowed fields, Traoré walked among the machines, watching farmers guide them with newfound confidence. The horizon glowed with possibility. In the midst of triumph, He paused to consider the journey, the obstacles, the betrayals, the skepticism. Each challenge had been a test, each doubt a fuel for determination. And now, as the tractors carved paths through the soil, one thought lingered in his mind. Africa had been underestimated for too long. Could this moment mark the beginning of a new era, one in which the continent finally seized control of its destiny? The answer seemed to whisper back from the fields themselves. Yes, yes it could. Yes it would, and in that quiet, profound certainty, Burkina Faso, and perhaps all of Africa, began to rise.